You know, one thing I always thought was so interesting and so cool about the life and ministry of the Apostle Paul in the Bible is the way that he received his gospel message. Because you have to understand, like, he talks about this in the beginning of the letter to the Galatians, where he talks about how, you know, he wasn't one of the original apostles, one of the disciples that walked with Jesus. In fact, he had never even met Jesus when Jesus was here during his earthly ministry, while he was discipling his original 12 apostles and all his other disciples. Paul had never met him at that time, and so he never received this gospel message. In fact, he says he didn't even know any of the apostles or anything, but he was on the road to Damascus. You all know the story, how Jesus came down and basically blinded him in blinding light and revealed himself to Paul and said, "Why are you persecuting me?" And so Paul received this revelation that Jesus Christ is the true Messiah. And from that day forth, he says that he went out by himself and sought Christ and began to pray and to study, you know, the Old Testament, the Word of God, and see how Jesus is the Messiah. And he says that his entire gospel message he received from direct revelation from Christ himself. And he goes out 3 years later, starts preaching this gospel message. And it wasn't until 3 years later where he finally met Peter for the first time. And he says that's the only apostle he ever even met. He met him and hung out with him for like 14, 15 days. And the only other person he met at that time was James, the Lord's brother. And so he says it wasn't until 14 years later that he finally goes and meets all the other apostles. And he goes to them and he proclaims to them the gospel message that he had been preaching, that he says he just received from revelation from God. Okay, this gospel message he hasn't heard from any of the apostles or from Jesus while he was on earth. He's going around preaching this. 14 years later, he goes to the original apostles and says, "This is the gospel message I've been preaching. Does it align with yours?" And they say, "Yeah, we don't ask you that you change anything about your message. All that we ask is that you go out proclaiming this gospel message and that you continue to remember the poor and help the poor," as Paul says he was eager to do anyways. So I just think that's amazing that Paul, as preaching this gospel message that he received as direct revelation from Christ himself from heaven, goes around preaching this gospel message. 14 years later, he goes and meets the original apostles that walked with Jesus and received this message directly from him. And both of these gospel messages align perfectly. I just think that's insane.